Chapter 4, From Colonies to States, 1607 to 1776. These are the core objectives that you should review as you are reading this chapter. This is a very long chapter that covers over 150 years, so please allow yourself plenty of time to read this chapter. The British system. The American colonies are going to act as part of the British economic system during the colonial period. The British economic system was something that we term as the mercantile system. Mercantilism was a system that was very common in Europe during this time, in which colonies were used to help countries amass wealth. In mercantilism, a country's greatness depended on how much wealth it actually had. When they were talking about wealth in the 17th and 18th centuries, they're talking about actual money, hard currency. They're not talking about intangible things like we do today. And so, in order to amass wealth, countries strived to become self-sufficient. And one of the ways that they became self-sufficient was to use colonies to produce things for themselves that the mother country could not produce for itself. So, like Great Britain, since it's an island nation and it's actually very small, the actual part of Great Britain is very small, colonies were used to produce all types of agricultural products that otherwise Britain would have to buy from other countries. One of the things that we see in this mercantilism system is that colonies exist to benefit the mother country. That's very important to remember. The colonies may have had reasons themselves for coming over, like the Pilgrims came so they could practice their certain religion. But as far as Great Britain was concerned, the only reason the colonies existed was so that the colonies benefited the mother country. And so almost from the beginning we see that there is going to be a juxtaposition of, in the colonies' minds, why they exist for their own benefit, so they can have freedom of religion or so they can advance economically. But as far as the British are concerned, the colonies only exist to benefit them. So in a system like that, we see that the British are going to have a lot of trade restrictions on these American colonies. And beginning during the 1660s, we see that there are going to be a series of what's known as the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were primarily aimed at the major products produced in the colonies. And what the British wanted to ensure was that they received all of these goods. And so things like tobacco, later cotton, sugar, any of those types of items that had a large market in Europe, the American colonies could only sell to Great Britain. They could not sell it to other colonies. They could not sell it to the French or the Spanish. They could only sell it to Great Britain. So the colonies exist to benefit the mother country and to make sure that the mother country is getting all of the benefits. The British colonies can only sell their products to Great Britain. Another part of the Navigation Acts was that the British colonies could only ship their goods in British ships. And that way Great Britain is also ensuring that their commercial fleet will make a lot of money off of the colonies. So the key to remembering this British system is that the colonies exist to benefit Great Britain. And of course, as the colonial period goes along, the British colonies begin to have resentment toward that, because they can possibly make more money if they sell to the French colonies or if they sell to the Spanish colonies. But legally, they can't do that. They are only there under the British auspices, and only the British are going to benefit from those products that they produce. Now, will the colonies find ways to get around these laws? Yes, they will. And so then that's going to also cause problems between the colonies and the mother country. Another aspect of mercantilism and the Navigation Acts was that the colonists also became consumers of British goods, because also under the Navigation Acts, the colonies were restricted from buying anything from other countries except Great Britain. So anything they needed to purchase had to go through Great Britain first. And sometimes that meant that these items became more expensive, because if the colonies wanted to buy sugar from the French Caribbean colonies, they could not buy it directly from the French. The French would have to ship it to France, then a British merchant would buy it from the French merchant in France, and then that British merchant would ship it back to the colonies. So you can see, with that many hands on it, the products would become more and more expensive. But what we begin to see because of this system is that the ties between Great Britain and the colonies become tighter and tighter. They actually end up in a very codependent relationship. A lot of times history books talk about that the colonies were very dependent on Britain, because Britain bought their goods and sold them goods, and the British protected them from the French and from the Native Americans when they had problems. But actually what we see happening, which becomes very evident when we move to the Revolutionary period, is that they were actually in a codependent relationship. The British needed the colonies to produce these items for them, and the British also needed the colonies to purchase items from them. And that is why we see, when we get into the boycotting, that the boycotts usually worked. So the colonies become financially tied to Great Britain, but Great Britain also becomes financially tied to the colonies. This chart shows us the colonial life and culture and the differences between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. And you can see economics, there are some similarities, but there's also some difference. Like in the north, they had fishing and shipbuilding, but as we discussed in earlier chapters, they did do small farming in the north. But these are more like your commercial endeavors. They did commercial fishing and commercial shipbuilding. In the south, farming cash crops was the major economic development. And the economics actually drives other things like the settlement patterns. So in the north, you have small villages and towns because they're living in these fishing villages. While in the north, you have the large plantations, so your populations are very spread out. You're going to have fewer towns. And then those are going to affect things like education. Because the population is so spread out in the south, we're not going to have very many schools. Mostly only the rich are educated, those people who could hire private tutors to live in their homes and educate their children. But in the north, we see you have a lot more schools because they're living in a village atmosphere, and so it is more practical to build schools. Also, we see in the north, the schools were often church-sponsored. And that was easy to do in the north because you really had one homogeneous religion. The major religion in the north was the congregational religion or the Puritan religion. And the focal point of their life was religion. That was one of the major reasons for settlement in the north. And so if you have one homogeneous religion, then it's easy for churches to sponsor schools because you don't have religious differences in those schools. While in the South, religion was not a major factor in establishing most of the southern colonies, with the exception of Maryland, which was found as a Catholic haven. The southern colonies were found mostly for economic reasons. We also see that there are very few churches in the South because the population is very spread out. It's not saying that the Southerners weren't religious, but there were just a lot of different religions in the South, and they don't have a lot of churches because their population is very spread out. Now, political power in both the northern and the southern colonies was mainly established through land ownership. While in the South, that is the defining element of political power, is to be a landowner. You have to be a landowner to vote. You have to be a landowner to own political property. It's also established in the North that most of the time, with very few exceptions, you had to be a landowner to vote or to hold political office. Pennsylvania, of course, would be an exception to that. Massachusetts Bay Colony would be an exception to that, because in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, remember, you had to be a church member to vote. But we see land ownership is a major factor in political power. Labor is also different, of course, in the North and the South. In the North, there was mostly free labor, independent farmers, small farmers, fishermen, merchants, very limited slavery. There was slavery in the North, but because they're not going to be the large plantations, slaves were used sparingly. It was frankly too expensive to have slaves in most cases. They used them some on the docks in New York. You had some slavery in early days in households as manservants and household staff. But by and large, they found that it was more practical to use paid labor than it was to use slave labor in the North. While in the South, which depended on cash crops, you had the large plantations, and the large plantations are going to depend on slave labor. So the major slave-holding area in the country is going to be in the South, even beginning in the colonial period. Even some small farmers in the South owned one or two slaves that helped them with labor on their small farms. So we see that even from the very beginning, the northern and southern colonies are going to be evolving very differently, and of course later on that's going to have some major impact. Okay, let's talk about education in the colonies. As we saw from our previous slide, there were more schools in the north, and so that of course had a lot to do with the economics of the fishing villages and also the homogeneous religion. So from the very beginning, we see that the North is more educated. When we look at education in the North, though, predominantly what we're looking at is what today we would consider elementary school type education. There were three types of schools in America during this time period, framed after really the British system of education. And the first type and the most common were the primary schools. Primary schools are what today we would really call like our elementary schools. This is where people learn to read and write, do basic arithmetic, they might learn a little geography, a little science, but we're looking at, you know, maybe what today we would consider up through about 6th grade or so. These were the types of schools that we saw in the fishing villages throughout the North and in the small towns in the South where they had schools. Then the second type of school was the Latin grammar school. Fewer people went to the Latin grammar schools. You usually only went to the Latin grammar school if you were going to go to college. At this time, you had to speak and read Latin in order to go to college, because the college courses were in Latin. And so only those people who were going to pursue higher education in college would go to the Latin grammar schools. We also see that the Latin grammar schools were also usually you had to pay a fee. So even in the North, you're not going to have a lot of the Latin grammar schools. They're not going to be available to the poorer people because they are going to be more fee-based schools. Then we do have in the colonies, we have colleges. The first college that was established in the English colonies was Harvard. Harvard was established primarily as a way to train Puritan ministers in Massachusetts. It was established in 1636, so very early on in the colonial period, Harvard was established. And then the second college that was established about 60 years later in 1693 was William and Mary. William and Mary is in Virginia. A focus of William and Mary in the beginning was to train Anglican ministers, or ministers for the Church of England, because that was the established religion in Virginia. And of course later both Harvard and William and Mary will spread out and evolve, where they're not just teaching religion, they'll be teaching literature and the law and eventually science when that becomes a little more popular. The third college that was established in the English colonies in North America was Yale. Yale was actually established by some Puritan ministers from Harvard who felt that Harvard was becoming too liberal, and so they broke off from Harvard in 1701 and created Yale. So that rivalry between Harvard and Yale goes all the way back to the establishment of Yale. As we move into the middle 1700s, the Enlightenment has taken a hold in Europe and has begun to spread to North America, and so it's becoming more common to study science, and a part of the study of science also helped to develop medical colleges. And so the Medical College of Philadelphia was created in 1765. It later became part of the University of Pennsylvania. And then in 1767, King's College was established also to study medicine. Today, King's College is Columbia, which is still considered to be one of the major medical colleges in the United States. Literature in the colonies. There was not a great deal of what today we would consider pure literature for a lot of reasons. One was that the colonists were simply so busy trying to scratch out a life and a living that you couldn't just devote your whole existence to becoming a writer and writing fictional books for pleasure. But there was some literature in the colonies. The most widely read book in the colonies was the Bible. Regardless of whether you were a Puritan or an Anglican or a Catholic, it didn't matter. Most families had a Bible. Oftentimes it was one of the most precious possessions of the family, was this family Bible, and so it was widely read by all colonists. It was very common for families to sit around the fire at night and the mom or the dad to read chapters out of the Bible to the family. Newspapers were also very popular in the colonies. The first major newspaper in the colonies was the Boston Newsletter. Newspapers were practical for the colonists. First of all, they were cheap. Books were very expensive at this time, so only the more wealthy people could usually afford books, but newspapers were cheap. And the articles were short, so the busy colonists who were scratching out a living had time to read the articles. Newspapers also were written at a very low reading level, about a 6th to 7th grade, maybe 8th grade reading level, which really today newspapers are still written at a low reading level. So you have a wider audience for those. Newspapers, as we move toward the Revolutionary period, are going to play a very big role in helping to spread anti-British propaganda and firing up the colonists to be supportive of the revolution. Probably the only major author that we would actually say we had in the colonies during this time period was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was really kind of our everyman. He was our Renaissance man of America during this time period. He was a newspaper editor. He owned a newspaper in Pennsylvania. He wrote Poor Richard's Almanac, which was a very popular farming almanac at the time. He was a scientist, he was an inventor, and so it was not, of course, uncommon then that he became an author and wrote Poor Richard's Almanac, which became very popular in the colonies. Religion, which we've already touched on a little bit in our previous slides. If we look at the colonies as a whole, there were many very diverse religions. We have the Puritans, which are very dominant in many of the northern colonies, what we call the New England colonies. In the middle colonies, we have the Quakers in Pennsylvania. We have, in the south, we have the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. We have Catholics. And then we're going to see, when the Great Awakening comes to the New World, that we're going to have even a lot of different religions, like the Methodists and the Baptists, that are going to join in and become very popular in the colonies. When we think of a region, which sometimes we say America was found for religious freedom, which, as we've discussed earlier, that's not exactly the case for most of the colonies. There were actually very few churches in the English colonies. There was really only a church, about one church for every 900 settlers. And a lot of that, of course, had to do with the rural nature of the colonies. And so instead of having established churches, what we often saw were itinerant ministers, ministers that travel from village to village. And so they would spend a few days in one village preaching, and then they would move on to the next village because, you know, of the rural nature of the colonies. As I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, the Great Awakening is a religious revival movement that hits the American colonies in the 1700s, about the 1740s. And it's going to have a profound effect on the colonies because what we see is the Great Awakening awakens in the colonists some different ideas about religion. And we see that the Methodists and the Baptists become major religions in the colonies during this time period. And while you would see Methodists and Baptists in Great Britain, the American version of Methodism was a little different. And so one of the things that had tied the colonies to Britain was common religion. And now we're seeing that that common religion is not so common anymore. One of the big figures in the Great Awakening in the North American colonies was Jonathan Edwards. He was a minister that went from town to town spreading the word of God. One of the focuses of the Great Awakening was to bring people back to traditional religion. Because of the Enlightenment, people were beginning to rely too much on science in the views of some of the traditional religious leaders. And so they wanted to bring people back to traditional religion. And one of Jonathan Edwards' very famous sermons was "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And this was a very common practice in these revivals, was to basically scare people back to God, that if you're a sinner and if you don't repent, if you don't change your ways, God is going to punish you. He's going to send you to hell. And so the Great Awakening had a huge effect. We see a lot of people moving back to more traditional religions, and religion growing in the North American colonies. During the colonial period, we're going to have what is sometimes termed as the colonial wars. They're basically going to be conflicts between Great Britain and France because of the rivalries between those two countries, and sometimes other countries become involved, like the Spanish will usually side with the French. But there are four major wars during this time period that are three of the wars will start in Europe and then spread to the colonies, and then the fourth war actually started in the colonies and spread back to Europe. A couple of the wars don't have a huge impact on the New World, but we're going to just kind of briefly mention those. The first one is the War of the League of Augsburg. In the colonies, the English colonists called this King William's War, because this is when William and Mary are the monarchs of Great Britain. And it's going to last from 1689 to 1697. Most of the fighting occurred along the Canadian New England border, because Canada was owned by the French during this time period. The American phase of the war really doesn't have any huge impact. It ended with a negotiated peace that established the balance of power in Europe, and it really doesn't have any lasting impact on the colonies. The second of the colonial wars is the War of Spanish Succession. This one is known in the colonies as Queen Anne's War, because William and Mary's daughter Anne is on the throne. It lasts from 1701 to 1713, which basically is most of Anne's reign in Great Britain. This war really changed the face of Europe. There was a complete redrawing of the map of Europe after this war. The British will defeat the Spanish and the French in the War of Spanish Succession, and so they are going to gain some property. The British gained some influence and property in Europe, and they will also at this time want the French to give them some land in North America. The War of Spanish Succession ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, and under the terms of that treaty, the French had to give to the English in North America Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Those were the two very first French settlements in the New World, and so that has some impact for the French. They were kind of resentful regarding that. But the English wanted those areas because they did a great deal of commercial fishing in those regions. Queen Anne's War has a huge impact on Europe, because after the war, it settled a lot of the major problems in Europe. And so we are going to actually have a generation of peace, a period of about 30 years, where there's not going to be a major war among the great powers of Europe. And that was very unusual for this time period. And so during this time period of peace, we're going to see that the English are prospering, and that meant that the English colonies were prospering. And so during this period, the English adopted what became known as salutary neglect. Under salutary neglect, the English still control their colonies, but they're not taking a lot of direct control over the colonies. They're allowing the colonies to grow and develop on their own. While the Navigation Acts were still in place, they're not being greatly enforced. And so what we see is the colonies become used to doing things their own way, and they become used to ignoring British laws and British rules. And so when you do that for a period of 30 to 40 years, later when the British come back in and try to enforce the laws, there's going to be resentment. And so this period of salutary neglect was a period that you might say was a adolescent period for the colonies. They're growing up. They're not infants that are dependent solely on the British anymore. They've developed their own trade networks. They've become accustomed to doing things their own way. And one of the things that we see that developed during this time period were many illegal trading organizations, smuggling, if you would. And of course, one of the most common was the smuggling network that was known as the Triangular Trade Network. Triangular trade was trade between the New England colonies that belonged to Great Britain, the West African colonies, which were mostly Dutch, and the West Indies, which were the Spanish and the French colonies in what today we call the Caribbean. It was illegal as far as the European countries were concerned because none of the products abided by the rules of mercantilism. These colonists established trading networks just among themselves, and so that made it violate the terms of mercantilism. Basically, the way it worked was the New England colonies would distill sugar into rum. They would trade that rum to the Dutch slave traders in West Africa for more slaves. Then those slaves would be taken from West Africa to the West Indies or the Caribbean, where they would be traded for more sugar. And then the sugar would be taken back to New England, where it was sold and distilled into more rum. And so the trading network went on and on. There was a lot of money made from this triangular trade. And it was just one example of the way the New England colonies and the other British colonies got around the navigation acts that Great Britain had placed on them. But this one is the one that we most commonly refer to. It's very easily explained through the triangle. The Third Colonial War was the War of Austrian Succession, or King George's War. This is George I. This was a conflict, once again, mostly between the English and the French. This time the English are going to be aided by Austria, and the French are going to be, once again, aided by the Spanish. The Spanish and the French always side with each other. During the fighting, there's a little more fighting in North America, and during the fighting, the New England colonists actually captured a major French fort known as Fort Louisburg. And one of the goals that the New Englanders had was that they wanted to gain control of more of Canada. And Fort Louisburg was right on the St. Lawrence River, and so they thought this would give them some trading advantages. Well, when the war was over, under the terms of the treaty, the British gave Fort Louisburg back to France in exchange for gaining some other possessions that the British wanted, mainly India, that the French had grabbed during the war. So the American colonists were very upset when the war is over. They felt like their sacrifice had pretty much just been thrown back in their face. That I think the realization really that they were just a pawn to the English really started to kind of come to a realization for them that the English didn't care that Fort Louisburg would give New England, trading opportunities. All they cared about was that giving Fort Louisburg back to the French allowed the British to gain another piece of property somewhere else in the world that they wanted. And so after King George's War, we began to see a little bit of grumbling in the colonies about what they perceived to be their place within the English Empire. The Fourth Colonial War was the French and Indian War, which is also referred to in European history as the 7 Years' War. Now, this war is different from the others. While the others began as European conflicts and spread to North America, this one actually starts in North America. There was a rivalry between the French and the British over who would control the Ohio River Valley. And so it actually began here, fighting over who would control that part of North America. And fighting occurred here for 2 years before it spread back to Europe and became known as the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War is going to have a huge impact on the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. And it's also going to have a huge relationship impact on the relationship between France and Great Britain. When we say French and Indian War, let's clarify that it was the French and Indians in North America, usually allied together against the British. There were a few Indian tribes that aided the British during this conflict, but most of the Indian tribes sided with the French because, frankly, all along the French had been nicer to them. So let's make sure we understand that it's the French and Indians allied together against the British. As we were saying earlier, the Ohio River Valley was the focal point of the conflict in North America. Who was going to control that? The way it started in North America was that the French had moved into the Ohio Valley and started building a fort there, Fort Duquesne. The English saw this as intrusion into their territory. At this time, parts of the Ohio River Valley were actually claimed by Virginia, and the English also had a fort in that area, Fort Necessity. So the governor of Virginia called up the Virginia militia, that's like the National Guard, and George Washington was in charge of the Virginia militia, and he was sent to run the French out of the Ohio Valley. Washington had some success at the beginning of the conflict. He attacked the French at Fort Duquesne. He caught the French off guard, and during the course of the fighting, the French commander was killed. And when the French commander was killed, the French surrendered the fort. And as was common practice at the time, Washington allowed them to leave the area. They just had to promise that they would not attack Washington's forces again, and they were allowed to leave. Well, the French were a little duplicitous in that they did not completely leave the Ohio Valley. They actually just regrouped and reorganized, and they are going to attack George Washington and his forces again. They attack at Fort Necessity. The French will sneak up on Washington, and they actually surround Fort Necessity and lay siege to the fort. And Washington realized that he didn't have all of his big guns in place at the fort. The fort was actually not complete, and he realized that he's completely surrounded. And so after about a day of being under siege, Washington decided that he would surrender. Washington is given the same treatment that he gave the French. He was allowed to leave the region, march his forces out of the Ohio Valley with the promise that he would not attack the French again in the Ohio Valley. Washington lived up to his promise. Now, he will attack the French again, but not in the Ohio Valley. And that is actually the beginning of the French and Indian War. The fighting, as I said, went on for a couple of years here in North America before it actually spread back to Europe. And when it spread to Europe, it became really the first global conflict. All of the major powers in Europe become involved. The British are going to be allied with the Prussians, which we would more commonly refer to today as Germany. The major players, once again, are going to be France and Spain on the other side. But there's going to be some fighting that's going to occur in India, in North Africa. So it really is a global conflict. In some ways, we could actually call it the First World War, if we wanted to. After 7 years of fighting on the global stage, the French were once again defeated by the British. It kind of is a trend during this time that the French always are defeated by the British in all four of these colonial wars. And the French and Indian War will end with what we call the Treaty of Paris, 1763. Under the terms of this treaty, the French will have to give up all of their claims to Canada to the British. So that whole New France, all of Canada, will be given to the British. The British will also force Spain to give them Florida. In most of the other conflicts, we see that the British have been more focused on punishing the French rather than punishing Spain. But after this conflict, they also want Spain to give up some land in North America, and so they asked for Florida. Because of Spain having to give Florida to the British, the French then will give Spain their Louisiana territory. France felt this was very important because their only true ally in the world was Spain, and they did not want to anger the Spanish. So when Spain had to give up Florida, they will give Spain the Louisiana territory, which had a long time belonged to the French. As a consequence of this conflict, we'll see when we look at the maps on the next slides that France is going to basically be kicked off of the North American continent, and England will emerge as the dominant power in North America. So that is going to begin to have some huge consequences in the relationship between the British and their North American colonies, because their relationship will also change, which we'll talk about later in the PowerPoint. This map shows us what North America looked like before the French and Indian War, at the conclusion of Queen Anne's War in 1713. You can see the green areas; those are the areas that belong to England, or at least that England claimed. You have the 13 English colonies there along the Atlantic seaboard, but you also have that area along the Hudson Bay. The brownish color areas are the French colonies. New France, which covers much of Canada, all the way down through the Great Lakes, and then that very large Louisiana territory. And then the pink area is the Spanish colonies, where you have lower parts of Texas, what today we consider Mexico, Central America, and then of course the Caribbean, Florida, and then well into South America. The British and the French did not have any colonies in South America. This second map shows us what North America looked like after the French and Indian War in 1763. Now you see this very large green area that Great Britain has. There is no brown area in the continent of North America. The French are completely gone. And then you have the pink area that now belongs to Spain. And so basically you could really say North America was divided between the Spanish and the English. But the reason we say that Great Britain became the dominant power in North America, even though Spain had almost as much territory, is because Spain was still mostly interested in their Central American and South American colonies. That's where they made most of their money. We do see there's one little part of brown with half of this island of Hispaniola. Haiti still remained a French colony, but all the rest of the Caribbean was either given to the Spanish or the British. There's some smattering of green in that area. This chart is just a synopsis of what we've talked about on the previous slides. It gives us the name of the war, the dates of the war, and what the results meant for Great Britain, and that of course would impact the colonies. After the French and Indian War, we begin to see the relationship between the American colonies and Great Britain changing. And some of that has to do with the fact that Great Britain had a huge amount of land now to govern, and they needed to find new ways of taking care of and governing those areas. And so one of the ways they decided to do this was by drawing a line that they said the American colonies could not um, settle beyond that line. This is known as the Proclamation of 1763. The line was drawn right around the Appalachian Mountains, and the American colonists were told that they could not settle west of that mountain range. It was a reaction really to conflicts with the Indians, and it was an attempt to keep Indian wars down. The colonists, though, saw that as a way of restricting their economic growth. They were very unhappy with it. They saw it as a way of the British trying to control them too much, and they're going to be very resentful about the Proclamation of 1763. Also, because the British have a lot more territory to look after in the New World now, they're going to pass a series of acts known as the Quartering Acts. Now, the Quartering Acts are something that I found through the years that many students don't quite understand. Quartering Acts were actually very common. These are not the first Quartering Acts placed on the colonies. And quartering was something that was done very commonly in Europe during this time. Basically, what it meant for the colonies was that the colonial assemblies had to vote money to support the troops. Rarely did it mean that the troops actually lived in people's personal homes. But what usually happened was the colonial assemblies had to place extra taxes on their colonies to build barracks for troops, to provide the troops with supplies, blankets, food, those types of things. The difference that we see with the Quartering Acts after the French and Indian War and before the French and Indian War was, before the French and Indian War, the colonists felt like they needed the British to protect them from the French. And so they were willing to have the troops there. They were willing to pay the taxes to support the troops. After the French and Indian War, when the French are no longer a threat on the North American continent, the colonists are resentful of the taxes, and they're resentful of the armies. There's a general distrust about keeping large standing armies in the colonies, and the colonists wonder, well, why did the British need these troops here? Are they trying to control us more? Which was actually part of what the British were trying to do. They were trying to cut down on the smuggling in the colonies. And the colonists know that, and so they're going to be resentful. But quartering was something that had actually been done for many years in the colonies. It's just the different circumstances after the French and Indian War. This map just shows us a good picture of where that proclamation line of 1763 was drawn. You can see that it basically is drawn right through the Appalachian Mountains, and the 13 original colonies were still had plenty of growing room, but the colonists are resentful toward the line. A second major problem facing the British after the French and Indian War was the debt from the war. The war had cost about 130 million pounds, and this was a time when countries felt like they needed to pay their debts. They did not keep deficits like we see today. So the British felt that one of the best ways to pay off the debt was to increase taxes. Now, this is another area where sometimes I see that we have a little bit of a misunderstanding here in America. Taxes were actually increased throughout the British Empire. And actually the taxes that were paid here in North America were less than paid in Great Britain itself. But what we see is after salutary neglect, the colonists had gotten used to not paying a lot of taxes. They had always paid their colonial taxes to their colonial assemblies. And so through the years, we see that the colonists had developed the attitude really that it was only the colonial assemblies that had the right to tax them. And so this is just an evolution in the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. And as we were saying, you know, the salutary neglect, the colonies got used to doing things on their own, and now Britain is going to be in their business all the time, and they're not going to like that. One of the first things the British did the year after the war ended in 1764, they passed the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was actually just a replacement act. It replaced the old Molasses Act, which was which had placed a import tax on foreign molasses coming into the colonies. The Sugar Act is the same thing, and it actually reduced the tax on sugar or molasses. It actually cut it in half from 6 cents a gallon to 3 cents a gallon. The Sugar Act is an indirect tax because it's a import tax, and the way that works is that the people that are importing the goods, the merchants that are going to sell the goods in the country, pay the tax. Well, they of course add the tax into the price that they charge their customers, but a lot of times we don't realize we're paying an import tax because it's already added in. So the Sugar Act is an indirect tax. And so the British think that this is what had mostly been done previously. They reduced the tax on sugar, but they also provided that the sugar tax would be collected by British tax officials, not colonial tax officials. This way, they feel that they will actually collect the tax. You won't have things like that triangular trade going on where there's a lot of sugar smuggled in and the taxes aren't paid. With the passage of the Sugar Act, we see the colonists are not happy. You know, it comes right on the heels of the proclamation of 1763. Now they're going to be expected to pay this tax on sugar. Yes, it is lower than they were paying before, but a lot of them weren't paying tax on sugar because they were buying black market sugar before. And so we see that the colonists begin to grumble. But with the Sugar Act, we don't see anything beyond really the grumbling, the fussing. But then the next year, 1765, we get the Stamp Act. Now the Stamp Act is a direct tax. That means that it's a tax that we're very much aware of paying. Probably the most common form of direct tax today is what we call our sales tax. You go to the store, you buy something, it costs $9.95, and then when you check out, it's, you know, $10.50 because you paid a tax on it. And you know that. It says on your receipt that you paid a sales tax on it. So the way the Stamp Act worked was the Stamp Act placed a tax on all paper documents. Legal documents, contracts, licenses, insurance documents, even newspapers, playing cards, anything that was made of paper was subject to this Stamp Act. And you would go in, you would buy your newspaper in the morning, and then you would pay an additional 1 cent or whatever to get your stamp on it that showed that you had paid the tax. So it's something that you pay after the price has already been set. It's with the Stamp Act that we see that the colonists then began to complain about being taxed without representation. This is when we start to hear that chant, no taxation without representation. And this actually causes some consternation in Great Britain in Parliament, because they're like, what do you mean you're not represented? You're represented. Parliament represents all of the British Empire. But what the colonists were talking about was what we would term as actual or direct representation, as opposed to what the British were talking about with virtual representation. the idea that the entire British Parliament represented the entire British Empire was somewhat alien to the Americans, who were used to their colonial assemblies taxing them. People they knew, people they had actually elected to serve in their colonial legislature. They didn't get to vote for who was in Parliament. They didn't get to send an actual person from Virginia to Parliament to sit there and talk about how these taxes would impact the colonists. And so once again, what we're beginning to see here with these ideas of representation is the colonies evolving differently than the British. By this time, we're hundreds of years beyond the first colonists coming here, over 150 years. And so the colonists, many of them have been born in North America. They had never been to Great Britain. And the parliamentary system is very alien to them. And they feel that only their colonial assemblies can tax them, because that's what they were used to under the salutary neglect. So when the colonists began to complain about the Stamp Act, the British were actually really kind of confused, because hey, we just passed the Sugar Act last year and you didn't complain about it. The colonists, 9 of the colonies got together and called the Stamp Act Congress. All of the colonies were invited, but only 9 showed up. In this Stamp Act Congress wrote up what became known as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Basically, what this is just saying, this is what we feel our rights are as English citizens. We are English citizens, because they had always been assured that they were English citizens. And these are our complaints. This is how we think that our rights are being violated. And they sent this Declaration of Rights and Grievances to Parliament. And the Parliament basically ignored it. They just felt like the colonists were being outrageous, and they don't even respond to it. So then the next step for the colonies was to issue non-importation agreements, basically saying, we're not going to import certain things from Great Britain. We're going to boycott these items. We're not going to buy these items. And so these non-importation agreements actually began to have a major economic impact on the British. And the non-importation agreements ultimately caused the Stamp Act to be repealed, because as the colonies refused to buy the items, it started to have a negative impact on British merchants, who had become dependent on the colonies buying their goods. And so then the British merchants will put pressure on Parliament, and Parliament will eventually repeal the Stamp Act. After Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, the British are still faced with this problem of, hey, we still have to pay off this war debt. How are we going to do it? So they passed a series of acts that became known as the Townshend Acts. And they're kind of reasoning, well, when we passed the Sugar Act, it was an import tax, it was an indirect tax, and the colonies didn't complain about it. So let's go back to that form of taxation. So the Townshend Acts placed a tax on certain imported items, glass, lead, paper, tea, things that the colonists had to import. So they placed this import tax on these items. And so they were surprised when the colonists became upset once again and complained about the Townshend Acts. Because what the British had missed in the response to the Stamp Act was not the type of tax, but the fact that the British were taxing them without them having representatives in Parliament. And so the colonists, once again, are going to start boycotting these items. They're not going to import glass, lead, paper, and tea because that's what worked for them the last time. Well, this time the British decide that they do have the right to tax the colonies, and they need to take kind of a firm stance with the colonies. So the British government is going to send additional troops to Boston to try to prevent smuggling. Of course, one of the big items that was smuggled was tea, because that was a staple item in the colonies. And so they send more troops to Boston, because that's an area where a lot of smuggling occurred, to keep the colonists from smuggling in mostly tea that they wouldn't be paying taxes on. That, of course, then caused an additional problem, because if we go back to our Quartering Act, that meant that the colonists then also had to increase their support for the British troops, because now there are more British troops in Boston. So we're going to see in Boston that there's going to be a lot of resentment toward the British, especially the British troops that are there, and that resentment begins to kind of smolder for about a year. Well, let's be honest, most of those British troops probably didn't want to be in Boston either. It's a long way from home, but they had to go because that's where they were told to go. But for about a year, you have a lot of this bad feeling that's going on in Boston, a lot of resentment. And so it's just going to take a very small incident to occur that's going to get blown up kind of out of proportion, if you would. And what began to happen was in early March, there was one of these smugglers that was arrested by the British troops there in Boston. And as the day went on, rumors began to spread through the city about the British, how they captured the smuggler and how he was treated, and things began to get blown out of proportion. He was tortured, and all kinds of things began to be said. And so the evening of March 5th, a group of protesters decided that they would go down to the barracks where the soldiers lived and voice their displeasure about what was going on. And, sometimes when you get a crowd, that crowd can get a little rowdy. And so during this protest, some of the people in the crowd started saying ugly things to the soldiers, and somebody started kind of pushing, and the soldiers began to feel a little intimidated. Eventually someone threw a snowball, and then some rocks were thrown, and things started really to escalate and get a little out of hand. And one of the soldiers panicked and fired on the crowd, and when that one person fired on the crowd, then of course several of the other soldiers fired on the crowd. And what we see then is that about 11 citizens were killed and injured during what became known as the Boston Massacre. Well, the very next day, we see that there's this, headlines in the Boston newspapers about the Boston Massacre, and pictures drawn. We'll look at a picture on the next line of the massacre that looks like it was a planned, event that the British orchestrated to fire on these people. Eventually, a couple of the soldiers were arrested for their involvement in the Boston Massacre. They were charged with manslaughter. John Adams will actually defend these soldiers, for which he received a lot of criticism and harassment from people living in Boston. But he said that everybody deserved a defense, and so he did his best to defend them. They were actually found guilty of manslaughter. But the citizens of Boston were not happy after the Boston Massacre. They wanted more people punished. They wanted the British troops to leave Boston, and that didn't happen. And what we really see with the Boston Massacre is two things. After the incident, the British realized that the Townshend Acts are a failure. They're not bringing in tax money because the people are boycotting them. And secondly, that it's just causing more problems in the colony. So the Townsend Acts were repealed. But from this point forward, we begin to see the escalation of the revolution. Samuel Adams, who was a very strong revolutionary, began to write a lot of anti-British propaganda that began to be published throughout Boston and the rest of Massachusetts. And he established what became known as the Committees of Correspondence. They started out in Boston, but the committees actually spread throughout the colonies, and they became mechanisms of anti-British propaganda and ways for the colonies to join together in criticizing the British and the British actions in the colonies. The Committees of Correspondence showed the colonies that what was happening in their colony wasn't an isolated incident, that the British were doing similar things in other colonies. And so this is really the beginnings of the revolutionary movement. And Samuel Adams played a very large role in that beginnings of that movement. This is that very famous picture of the Boston Massacre that spread first in Boston and then across the colonies. If you look closely at the picture, you can see that it looks like the British are lined up in a very neat, orderly fashion. So the commander is standing behind them with his sword drawn, as if he's telling the people to fire on the colonies. So from the picture, it looks very much like the British had an organized attempt to massacre the colonies. And then you see the colonists or you see the dead colonists, you see the blood there, you even see the little dog in the picture, so it makes it look like the colonists are blameless in the event, as if they were just kind of walking down the street and the British opened fire on them. And of course, that's not exactly what happened. After the Boston Massacre, we have a couple of years where there's kind of an uneasy peace. There's not going to be any big major events that occur in the colonies. But then in 1773, the British are going to place a new act on the colonies. It's known as the Tea Act. The Tea Act actually also shows us how much the colonies had become different from the British. The Tea Act actually reduced the tax on tea. There had been a tax on tea since the Townsend Acts. Before the Townsend Acts, the tea tax was one of the things that they kept in the Townsend Acts after the Townsend Acts were repealed. But the Tea Act actually reduced the tax on tea. The British reduced the tax on tea actually in hopes that the colonists would start to buy more tea. What they were trying to do with the Tea Act was to save the British East India Company. The British East India Company was a major company in Great Britain, and it found itself in the 1770s virtually bankrupt. And so the British were actually trying to save that company because it would have a major economic impact on Great Britain. And so they lowered the tax on tea, but they gave the British East India Company a monopoly over the sale of tea in the colonies. That meant only the British East India Company could sell tea to the colonies. And the colonists became very upset about this. I think by the time we get to the Tea Act, we're 10 years out from the French and Indian War, and so much has happened that the British are not trusted by the colonists. The colonists feel that there must be a reason that the British are lowering this tax and giving this monopoly to the British East India Company. Something is going to happen that's going to be bad for us. And so the colonists decided that they would boycott the tea. And by this time we have a group of revolutionaries that have become more organized in Boston, and they are calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty decided that as a form of protest against the Tea Act, that they would dress up as Indians and they would go down to Boston Harbor, where there were some ships from the British East India Company, and they would dump all of the tea overboard. And so this night in December of 1773, they dressed up like Indians and they went into Boston Harbor and they threw 342 chests of tea overboard, littering the harbor and causing huge financial strain on the British East India Company. And so this, of course, has become known in American history as the Boston Tea Party. The British decided after the, quote, Boston Tea Party that they had to deal very firmly with the colonies. And so they are going to pass a series of acts that become known as the Coercive Acts in Great Britain. Here in North America, we call those the Intolerable Acts. The British are basically going to punish, very severely punish Boston and the colony of Massachusetts for the Tea Party. They think that the colonists are really getting out of hand and they have to show their strength or they're going to lose control of the colonies. And basically the coercive acts were designed to scare the other colonies by placing very severe punishments on Boston. They were hoping to scare the other colonies into doing the right things. Some of the things that we see in the coercive acts or the intolerable acts, first of all, they closed the port of Boston. The port of Boston was closed until all of the tea was paid for. Now for Boston, which was a major shipping center in the colonies, this is going to cost them a lot of money because that was their main avenue of making money. They also are going to revoke the charter for Massachusetts. That means that they take away all the rights and privileges that the colonists had under that charter. Massachusetts was placed under martial law, where a general and the British Army would be in charge of the colony. They prohibited town meetings. It became illegal for the towns to meet. They don't want people to gather together and complain and maybe orchestrate other acts of rebellion. So town meetings were prohibited. And they placed a new quartering act on Massachusetts because they're going to bring more troops in to keep the order of Massachusetts, and so they're going to need more money to do that. The colonists responded to the Intolerable Acts by calling the First Continental Congress, and 11 of the states are actually going to participate in the First Continental Congress. Georgia, which was the newest state, will not participate. They were hoping to convince the British to relax some of these restrictions on them. They were hoping for maybe some last-minute compromise. But we see by the time we get to the First Continental Congress that some of the major revolutionary leaders are beginning to emerge. Patrick Henry of Virginia, this is when he gives his very famous speech where he says, "I don't know what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." We'll also see individuals like Samuel Adams, John Hancock. They're going to be very involved in the First Continental Congress. One of the things that we see that the First Continental Congress will do is they are going to adopt what became known as the Suffolk Resolve. The Suffolk Resolves denounced the coercive acts as unconstitutional. They said that the coercive acts went against the British Constitution by taking away their rights as Englishmen. The Suffolk Resolves also advised the people to arm themselves, to be prepared to defend themselves against the British. And they called for economic sanctions against the British. They're going to call for a total boycott of all English goods. in order to enforce that total boycott of all English goods that the First Continental Congress had called for, the Continental Congress also created the Continental Association. These people would punish any individuals who bought British goods. We would see one of the common things that they did if they caught someone buying English goods, they would tar and feather them. They also created their own parallel governments. They called up the state militias. The militias began to organize. They began to drill, to practice for war. They also began to stockpile weapons, preparing for an eventual conflict that they felt was coming with the British. We also see that the Continental Association wrote a petition directly to the King, to King George III. They hoped by appealing to George III that he could rein in Parliament and keep Parliament from being so punitive toward them. What the colonists didn't understand is George III was actually more of a tyrant than Parliament was at this time. As I was saying on the previous slide, the Continental Congress had called on the colonies to call up their colonial militias and to train and to drill and stockpile weapons. And of course, the British know this. It's really kind of an outright rebellion toward the British by stockpiling these weapons and training and drilling. And so General Gage, who was the British general in charge of the troops in Boston, decided that he needed to act quickly and decisively to put down this revolution before it ever started. So General Gage decided, acting on information that he had, that he would try to take out a couple of the strongholds of colonial rebellion. Two of the major leaders were Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and he had information that Samuel Adams and John Hancock had amassed weapons at Lexington and Concord, and that they were hiding out in those areas. So General Gage is going to order the British troops to attack Lexington and Concord. And this, of course, is when we have our famous Paul Revere story, where the British had their spies and knew that the colonists had weapons at Lexington and Concord. The colonists also had their spies that had gotten information that the British were going to attack those areas, but they didn't know if they were coming by land or by sea. And so we see that the British are going to, Paul Revere is going to be waiting for a signal from the Old North Church to know if the British are coming by land or by sea. And once he gets that message, Paul Revere rides through the countryside, warning the colonists that the British are coming, the British are coming. Of course, there's a little truth to that. Paul Revere did ride through the countryside warning people, but there were also other riders that rode with him so that they could amass all the people. What happens because of Paul Revere's ride, though, is that the British are going to, the colonists are going to know that the British are coming. And by the time the British get to Lexington, which was the first village out from Boston, the colonists are waiting for them. And the British commander orders the colonists to disperse, to go home. The colonists refuse. And no one's actually sure who fired the first shot, but a shot rang out, and then of course these two armies were facing off against each other, and so everybody starts firing. And in the midst of that, some colonists and some British soldiers were shot. The British actually won at Lexington, and they were able to capture the store of weapons at Lexington. But because of the warnings, the Minutemen had not, the Minutemen had slowed down the British army, and also we see that if John Hancock and Sam Adams had been in the area, they had been able to escape. After taking Lexington, the British troops move on to Concord. And we see at Concord, the colonists are going to be more organized. The Minutemen had more time to prepare at Concord. And so when the British get to Concord, it's going to be a different story. The British are actually going to be defeated at Concord. And the British are actually going to have to retreat all the way back into Boston. And so Lexington and Concord really changes the whole face of the conflict. Now we're looking at the colonies being in outright rebellion. At this stage, there's going to be no going back to just boycotting. Sometimes Lexington and Concord are referred to as the shots heard around the world, because we really signal Lexington and Concord as the beginning of the American Revolution. Even though for the first year, this is in 1775, for the first year the colonists are fighting for their rights as Englishmen, there's really no going back to just boycotting after you've had this fight and blood has been shed. This slide just shows us again some of the new laws and that were passed that upset the colonies, and so it's a good way for you to look at things as you're preparing for your test, to look at some of these laws and what they did. And this is just in a chart format for you. After Lexington and Concord, as we were saying earlier, everything really changed between Great Britain and the colonies. And this is when the colonies will call the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress will involve all of the colonies. It convened in May of 1775, a couple weeks after Lexington and Concord. Fighting was still continuing as the British had retreated back to Boston. The colonial militias had followed them, and there was still intermittent fighting going on between them. In that early summer, the Second Continental Congress is going to send what became known as the Olive Branch Petition to George III, trying to reach out, offering to, meet with the British to try to solve their differences. They also passed the Declaration of Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. This was really more for the colonists, to show the colonists why we're fighting and try to get more colonists to join in the fight against the British, reiterating many of the atrocities that had been committed against the colonies, complaining about the taxes, and of course playing up the Boston Massacre and the fighting at Lexington and Concord. The Second Continental Congress ends up really being the revolutionary government. They're going to be in operation through the Revolutionary War. The Second Continental Congress has a couple of challenges now that they know they can't go back to just boycotting. They need to have a more organized army, and so they call for the creation of the Continental Army. And George Washington was selected to be the leader of the Continental Army. There were actually other individuals that wanted to be the leader, and other individuals were held up, as possible candidates for being the leader of the Continental Army. But George Washington ended up being selected, I think mainly because he was very well respected in the colonies. Other people had as much military experience as he had, and some had even more. But he was very well respected, and that's going to be very important during the American Revolution. A second big challenge facing the Second Continental Congress was financing the war. Because of the mercantile system that they had been living under as colonies, there's not a lot of actual money in the colonies. They traded with the British. A lot of the individuals were in great debt, actually, to Great Britain. So financing the war is going to be a challenge. In the early years, they're going to rely a lot on loans. And these are going to be loans from the few wealthy individuals that live in the colonies. They are going to sell war bonds, hoping people will help to finance the war. That's going to bring in some money, but not huge amounts of money. They also relied on what we call the requisition system, and that was basically the army would just go through areas and take what they needed, and they leave you with an IOU. Well, we're going to take these 10 horses, and here's an IOU. When the war's over, take it to the government and we'll pay you for it. That is not a very popular way of financing a war. We see that as the war goes on, the colonists begin to hide things from the Continental Army when they're coming through. They hide their pigs and their chickens and things like that so that they can't be requisitioned by the Army. Another thing that we see that causes some problems as the war goes on is just printing paper money. If you print too much paper money, it loses its value, and that's going to cause problems for the colonies. As they print more and more paper money, they don't have any gold or silver to back it up, and the money becomes virtually just paper. And we see a lot of the colonial merchants won't accept the money. We see that the soldiers basically aren't even really getting paid because the money has no value. In the first couple years of the war, we're not going to see very many foreign loans. Pretty much everybody's waiting to see if the colonists can win. But after 1781, we begin to get money, especially from the French and the Spanish, who will begin loaning huge amounts of money to the American colonies, hoping that it will help defeat the British. While the Second Continental Congress is still meeting before George Washington can even take command of his troops, the first major battle of the American Revolution is going to occur, and that's the Battle of Bunker Hill. And it really goes back to the battle at Concord. Remember, as we were talking, the British troops retreated back to Boston. The colonial militias followed behind them, and the colonial militias took up positions in the high grounds around Boston. It's an area known as Dorchester Heights. And the American commander in that area is Colonel William Prescott, and he has under his command about 1,600 troops, because as word got out about Concord, more people began to join, and they came to help out Prescott and the Americans there. From this high ground, Prescott and his Americans can cause some havoc for the British. As the British troops go out on maneuvers, or they go out on reconnaissance missions, the Americans can kind of pick them off because they're in the high positions. And so General Gage once again decides that he needs to put a stop to this, and so he is going to call on one of his very able generals, he thought at the time, and he's going to order General Howe to go out into the Dorchester Heights area and defeat the Americans. And what he is once again hoping is that if he can defeat the American army there, because that's the main contingent of American troops at the time, then he can end this war before it even really gets started. And so General Howe is going to get together about 2,200 troops. These are some of the best trained troops that the British have to offer. They're battle hardened. They fought in wars in Europe, and Howe thinks he can make, easy victory over these ragtag farmers of the Americans. And so he really underestimated the Americans and what they could do. Howe decided, because of his real disdain for the American army, that he could just make a full frontal assault on the Americans. And what he's counting on is that these Americans, since they're not well trained, when this mighty British army goes charging up Dorchester Heights hills, that the Americans will panic and just start retreating. And so he orders his troops to make this major assault, charging up actually what is Breed's Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill is misnamed, and General Prescott actually had a very good handle on his troops, and he told his troops to wait, not to fire. A very famous quote that's given is he told them, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." Basically what he's telling them is to wait till you know they're within range, because one of the things the Americans knew is that they didn't have a lot of ammunition. They have the best position because they have the high ground, and they're embedded in that high ground. So all they have to do is wait on the British to get close enough, and they can start picking them off. So Howe orders his troops to go charging up the hill, and they go charging up the hill, and the Americans start firing on them when they get close enough, and a lot of the British troops are killed, and the British retreat back down the hill, where Howe is waiting on them, and he regroups and he reorganizes them, and then he orders them to make a second charge up the hill. And in the second charge up the hill, we see pretty much the same thing happening as happened in the first, and the British troops go retreating back down. And Howe regroups and reorganizes them and orders them to make a third charge up the hill. And actually the third charge, is the charm for Howe. When Prescott realized that Howe was going to make a third charge up the hill, he realized that he was going to run out of ammunition. So what Prescott did was he ordered an orderly retreat. He's going to leave back enough soldiers to fool the British into thinking that the Americans are still in the hill, but he will actually retreat with most of the army out of the area. So when Howe and his troops make the third charge up the hill, they actually win the hill. And so the Battle of Bunker Hill is considered to be a British victory because they win control of the land. But as one of the British commanders said, well, if we have very many more victories like that, we're going to lose this war. Because the British lost about half of their troops in the Battle of Bunker Hill. They lost over 1,000 troops, and a 50% casualty rate is a very large casualty rate. The Americans, on the other hand, lost only about 100. And the bigger objective was that the American army got away. So a lot of times we say that the Battle of Bunker Hill is actually a moral victory for the Americans. While they did lose, they know that they can win. They didn't lose because the British were so much better than them. They lost because they did not have enough supplies. And so after the Battle of Bunker Hill, we see that as Washington is taking over the Continental Army and trying to organize this Continental Army, there's going to be a lot of support, and a lot of people began joining the army. So it is a moral victory for the Americans. If you click on this hyperlink area, there's a little very short video that you can watch that talks about Bunker Hill and some of the little known facts about Bunker Hill that you might want to check that out. As we are moving now into a organized war, still as we move into the fall of 1775 and the early months of 1776, the Americans are still fighting for their rights as English citizens, but the British and the Americans have different war aims. The British war aim is unconditional citizens, unconditional surrender. That means that the British are going to, in the early years at least, refuse to negotiate with the Americans. The idea is that any negotiation at all with the Americans legitimizes the American movement. It legitimizes their claims that their rights are being violated. And so the British have to fight for unconditional surrender, which means that they have to completely defeat the Americans and then impose peace on them. The Americans, very different. They're fighting for their rights as Englishmen. They're later, of course, after 1776, they're going to be fighting for independence. But George Washington knows that he just has to keep an army in the field. That as long as he can keep an army in the field, even if it's small, then the revolution is continuing. And his goal really pretty much is to wear the British out. That if we can keep an army in the field long enough to wear the British out, then they eventually will have to negotiate with us and give in to some of our demands. By the time we get to January of 1776, there's began to be talk in the colonies of making this war for a greater purpose. And a lot of this comes about because of a pamphlet, a political pamphlet that was written by Thomas Paine. It was called the Common Sense Pamphlet. And in many ways, the Common Sense Pamphlet is the precursor to the Declaration of Independence. In the Common Sense Pamphlet, Paine begins by being very critical of the king, King George III. And this was a new take on things. We saw during the first 10 years after the 7 Years' War that the colonists always blamed Parliament, but they felt the king was on their side. But Thomas Paine begins to point out to the colonists that the king is not on their side. He even calls the king the royal tyrant in the Common Sense pamphlet. And in the pamphlet, he begins to point out, the differences between the colonies and England and how they have evolved differently politically. And that if we're fighting this war, it just makes common sense to fight it for a greater purpose, to fight for independence, because we've become too different from the British to stay in the empire. And so a lot of people read the Common Sense pamphlet. It became very popular. And so the Second Continental Congress felt that it was important to set up a committee to discuss independence, and the committee actually decided that it would be the best goal to go ahead and declare independence. And so the committee, the Congress will create a committee to write the Declaration of Independence. I know we've all been told throughout our lives that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and technically he did actually do the writing, but he was actually part of a committee. Ben Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson all served on this committee to come up with the ideals that would be put into the Declaration of Independence. They decided what the elements of the Declaration should be. And then Thomas Jefferson, because he was the best writer, was actually assigned the task of writing the document. A lot of what we see in the American Declaration of Independence is actually based on John Locke's social contract theory. And when we look at the Declaration of Independence, the actual declaration is really three parts. And the whole first part talks about the social contract theory, that there is this contract between governments and their people, in which the government is supposed to take care of the people, to look after the people. The government is charged with the safety and security of the people, and that in exchange for that protection, the people are willing to give up some of their rights to the government. But if that government does not fulfill that contract, if the government does not take care of the people, if the government does not secure the people, then the people have the right and the duty to overthrow that government. And so that's like the whole first part of the Declaration. Then the second part of the Declaration of Independence really is the grievances the complaints the colonies had against Great Britain. This is the list of indictment, I guess, if you want to say, where they say that he locked us up in prisons overseas, he burned our towns, he taxed us without our consent. And this he that they are referencing in the Declaration of Independence is George III. They are indicting the king. They're saying that the king, who is the embodiment of the English government at this time, is not fulfilling that contract. And then it's in the third section of the Declaration of Independence where there's actually the Declaration of Independence. It's the shortest part of the Declaration, and this is they start out in the Declaration. Jefferson says, you know, at every turn we've tried to negotiate, we've tried to, you know, we've given these petitions, we've tried to, you know, make up with Great Britain, and they won't, you know, even be reasonable at all. And so since they will not work with us, then we have the right and the duty to overthrow this government and declare independence. And so the Declaration of Independence was written by this committee, mostly by Thomas Jefferson, but the ideals came from everyone. It was presented to Congress on July 2nd, 1776. As usual, any kind of Congress wanted a few changes made, and so then some changes were made, and the Declaration was adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, and then it was presented and read to George Washington and the troops on July 9th. And so from that point forward, the American Revolution is a revolution in fact, because now we are fighting for independence, not just for our rights as Englishmen.